So good morning to everyone that has just joined us, and hello to everyone watching the replay. Welcome to another one of our learning webinars, this time all about domestic ventilation competency. Do we need to aim higher? I am your host, Andy Ferguson, and joining me today, I'm pleased to welcome back John Bradley, Principal Technical Consultant at Cornerstone and the current Poitiers Board Chairman. We are about to start the main presentation. Just for those just joining us, if you do want to pose a question over the webinar, I would just encourage you to use the chat facility in either the left or the right hand side on the desktop. If it's a mobile, just pull it up and you'll see the chat there. If you want to email your question, simply just go to andy@property-care.org. That's andy@property-care.org, and that's the same for anyone watching the replay. Feel free to email it over and I will try to endeavour to get your question answered. So, John, I can see we're pretty much bang on 9 o'clock. Certainly from my perspective, it seems at this moment in time that anything to do with dampness, mould and adequate ventilation still seems a very, very hot topic. And I think going by the interest in this particular webinar and the audience that's coming in on this webinar, that it kind of almost screams that as well. Interestingly, the other day there, I actually saw on ITV News, new laws finally passed in the wake of the tragic events last year when the young boy passed away due to the excess mould exposure. Now, I suppose the passing of this new law effectively give tenants a stronger protection for issues such as dampness, condensation and mould. But I suppose when it comes to cases where professional property specialists and surveyors need to review whether ventilation within a property is adequate enough to resolve these damp and mould issues, I mean, what sort of level of training should these individuals have, and how and where do we get this knowledge? I'm actually hoping you'll be able to fill not only myself in, John, here, but the many individuals that are joining us this morning. So without further ado, I suppose it's over to yourself, good sir.
Thank you, Andy. Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us this morning. Thank you. There's not many certainties in this world, but there is, unfortunately, I think, one, and it's that in just a few months' time from now, millions of people throughout the UK will be living in homes suffering from condensation dampness. Mould growth, streaming windows, damaged clothing will be found in homes up and down this country. It's been happening for decades, and if we're truly to deal with these symptoms, which can range from just being a minor irritation for the occupants up to, in seriously affected homes, some heartbreaking and tragic consequences. Now, there's many factors. We all know, if you've attended this session, you'll know that there's many factors which can contribute towards condensation dampness. And we'll all know that a lack of adequate ventilation is often a very significant one. There's no doubt that there's been good progress made in the last decade in terms of improving the knowledge of those of us involved in whatever capacity in trying to provide adequate ventilation to UK homes. But the big question is, are we doing enough? And if we're not doing enough, what else should we be doing? So the course of the webinar this morning, what we're going to cover is we're going to look at what level of training and qualifications do we have at present in the UK? What do I think the level that we need to have and why we need it? And how and where can we get what we need? So what level of training and qualifications do we have at present here in the United Kingdom? Well, really, I want to go a wee bit back in time, because that's when I think the year 2010 was the origin, really, of what we have now. And back in 2010, I was entering, shows my age here, right? I was entering my 4th decade working in the ventilation industry. And I was running a small sort of ventilation business that was involved in going out into existing homes and trying to tackle condensation dampness problems. There was a lot of new build going on back in those days, and we were fitting ventilation systems in new build homes, in particular mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. And we were getting involved in all sorts of kind of specialist stuff. So That's what I was doing back in 2010. And also in 2010, approved document F, which is all to do with ventilation, was published, and it replaced the document which was 2006. And the intention of that document was to try and raise the standards of ventilation, because as I said earlier, for decades we had this problem of condensation and mould. And that document, when it came out, was considered a good document, and it looked at things like occupancy levels and the like, and gave good guidance, plenty of diagrams, lots of guidance on how ventilation systems should be designed, especially focused on new build, but gave a bit of advice on existing dwellings as well. To complement that, there was a domestic ventilation compliance guide come out as well. And again, that gave good information to people involved in the design, supply and installation of systems, again, especially for new build homes. And it was considered a document at the time that would help sort of raise the quality of installations and systems get into, as I said, in particular new build homes, but also in existing homes. And back then, an organisation called Polypipe, in conjunction with BPEC, launched what was the UK's first independently certified and accredited domestic ventilation installers training course, and emphasise the word installers there. And that was to support that new approved document F, which I talked about in the earlier slide, and that domestic vent compliance guide. And I was honoured to kind of join a kind of group of esteemed, much more important and knowledgeable people than me, to kind of speak at that launch as someone who was considered, without sounding conceited, maybe someone involved who knew a bit about the design, supply and installation of ventilation systems as a contractor. What's happened since then is that we in the PCA recognised that perhaps some of the training and qualifications that were available were more focused towards really new build dwellings. So we launched what was called the Residential Ventilation Masterclass to really tackle what is the biggest problem with condensation dampness, which is existing dwellings. The vast majority of houses, there's 27 million dwellings already there. We only build a few 100,000 every year. So we launched a course to satisfy the requirements of members that was looking at very much what we do to resolve condensation problems within existing dwellings using ventilation. And it was a really good course, and we had, I'm sure there's a few people who are watching this webinar who were some of the people at the very first course that we ran there. And I think it was fair to say it was a really good course, and certainly helped improve the knowledge of people involved within trying to resolve problems within existing homes. More recently, what we've had is the introduction of a new approved document F, which replaced the previous document. And some people have been maybe a bit disappointed with the content of this new approved document F in terms of maybe a lack of the sort of guidance diagrams and what have you, and very much focused on the number of bedrooms and floor area instead of the previous document, which was based on the number of occupants and floor area to work out ventilation rates. Because as most people know, it's people that produce the pollutants that can affect indoor air quality, not bedroom numbers. But that's something I'm sure that the people involved in looking at the approved documents going forward will consider. What's noticeable is no more mention of the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide. In fact, there isn't one. But I'll come back to that in a little minute when I talk about something else. What else has happened? If you look at what's currently available in terms of, remember when I talked about the origin, the very first BPEC course, we now have BPEC and NIC, EIC offering domestic ventilation installers courses. And I've put up here the kind of extracts from the various websites that promote the course that's run. It's a 2-day course. It's a good course if you're very much an installer who wants to be involved in designing, supplying and installing ventilation systems. But again, I would say it's mainly focused, from the experience I have of people that have been on it and the feedback I've had, it's very much focused on new build homes as opposed to existing homes, but a very good set of courses that both of these organisations offer. And if you look at what those courses can lead to just now in terms of qualification and why they link to something called ventilation competent person schemes, on the left of this slide, what you can see is a copy of a certificate for someone who's passed that course this year, 2023. You probably can't see, but if you were to look close enough, you'll see that it actually refers to the Domestic Ventilation Compliance Guide 2010, which I think is quite interesting, bearing in mind the new approved document came out in 2021 and came into effect last year, 2022. But that's the type of qualification that's available to installers just now to join what would be called a ventilation competent person scheme. That would be the qualification ventilation-wise that they would look to support the criteria for joining a competent person scheme. And the certificate that you've got in the middle of this slide is an example of a certificate from an organisation called NAPIT, from an organisation who's applied to be a member of a ventilation competent person scheme, which in turn allows them to notify to building control ventilation installations, like the notification certificate you will see in the top right hand corner. Now that is it's a requirement to notify any ventilation you fit in an existing or a new build home. In an existing home, it would be notifiable if it can be tested and adjusted, and it's rare to find a piece of ventilation equipment now that doesn't have some form of testing and adjustment. I go back though to the fact that the existing BPEC and NIC, EIC domestic ventilation installers training courses are, in my view anyway, more suited to people looking at new build installations. When it comes to existing homes, I think that the PCA Residential Ventilation Masterclass has stood us in good stead for that as well. So that's the kind of background to what we've got just now. So I'm now going to kind of share with you what I think, well, certainly my views in terms of what level of training and qualifications we need and why we need it. Well, I'm paraphrasing an old saying that we're all kind of familiar with, but there's no doubt, I think, that if we keep doing what we've been doing, we'll get similar results. We've got to do things better, all of us involved within the industry in terms of tackling condensation and dampness. I think we need more than minimum technical competency, because that tends to be what the level of qualification and training that we've had in the past aims for. And I think we have to go for more than minimum technical competency. I think what we need in the UK for truly to tackle these issues is we need a large pool of suitably trained and qualified specialists. We need specialists if we're going to make the progress that we need to make in preventing and solving problems related to inadequate ventilation in our houses in the UK. So I think if I was sort of saying, what does a specialist look like? I think we need specialists who are capable of doing all of the following, and some more stuff on top, I think, and have to be able to be there, right, capable anyway of looking at properties from the time that they are new dwellings to the time they become existing dwellings. And that's a very short period of time, remember, from the time that they're a new dwelling, it can be hours before they become an existing dwelling, because as soon as people walk in that door, it's an existing dwelling. So I think we need specialists who can, to start with, in new dwellings, have to be up to date with all the regulatory requirements, and there are loads of them. There are so many approved documents, the main one I've talked about today, and please can ask for forgiveness from my colleagues in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, where I live in. I know I have mentioned approved document F, and I know it's to do with England, and I know we have different regulations throughout the UK for different parts of the UK, but what I'm saying here really kind of generally applies throughout the UK. And I'll cover a wee bit about that later on today as well. But what we need to have are specialists who, and I know it's boring reading all these approved documents, I know the detail can be hard to go through, but we need to have an up-to-date good knowledge of all those requirements, guidance documents, and best practice guides in relation to new build and existing dwellings. I think we need people who are able to design and specify any of the three main types of ventilation, which are detailed in approved document F and all the other documents and guidance and what have you for the different parts of the UK for new build dwellings. They need to be capable of knowing what a ventilation system is like for a new build dwelling. And approved document F and the other documents that cover the rest of the UK cover three main methods of ventilation. There's natural ventilation, continuous mechanical extract ventilation, and mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. And just to remind people about what each of those looks like, left-hand diagram shows background ventilators and intermittent extract fans. That would be considered a natural ventilation system. It used to be called in the old regulations background ventilators and intermittent extract fans, but that is essentially a natural ventilation system. And what that is a ventilation system that relies on background ventilators, the most common of which we would all know would be trickle vents and windows and doors, left open during winter to allow the building to ventilate naturally through a combination of stack effect and wind effects. And that has to provide that whole dwelling ventilation rate naturally. The extract fans, the clues in the name, they're intermittent. They're really only used at times of high moisture or pollutant generation to give additional extract within the wet rooms. And that is a natural ventilation system that is a form of ventilation that has maybe not enjoyed the best record of success over the years, perhaps understandably because people can't maybe see the benefit, maybe see a bit of a contradictory message that we have to leave trickle vents open in double glazed or triple glazed windows in the middle of winter when the feeling might be, or the perception might be, that we should be keeping the heat in. So it's maybe not enjoyed the level of success. The next form of ventilation is continuous mechanical extract, which is either extract from the wet rooms, where the replacement air either comes in through background ventilators in the rooms that don't have extraction, or from the building fabric itself, or a combination of both. And the extraction can either be from a centralised extract unit or individual extract fans within the wet rooms, or a combination of both. And that's gaining a good track record, that method of ventilation, in providing adequate ventilation in homes. Then the final method that's got to be capable of design and new build would be continuous mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, which essentially comprises of delivering fresh outside air into habitable rooms, simultaneously extracting from wet rooms and using the heat within the air extracted from the wet rooms to temper the incoming air coming in from outside and hopefully reduce the energy consumption that's required to heat the ventilation air. Very, very good systems, but require real detailed design to start with, installation, commissioning, and ongoing maintenance as well. But we need specialists who are capable of doing all that. And I have to say here that that type of training you will get in the BPEC and NIC, EIC courses will give you a good basic knowledge of how to do all of that. They've also got to be capable of kind of looking at like designs using the type of information that I put up here. I don't expect you to read it all, but using the type of information, they should be able to look at plans, drawings, some basic data, and then work out any ventilation system for any of the three ventilation systems we've talked about, and look at purge ventilation requirements, door undercuts, opening window sizes and areas, extract rates, whole dwelling ventilation rates, which is the critical figure as far as I'm concerned, which we'll cover in a wee bit of detail. All of those things, they have to be capable of doing that. But then we have the real issue, existing homes. As I said earlier, we have 27 million, give or take a few million, existing dwellings. And any new build dwelling becomes an existing dwelling very, very soon when people move into it. So we need specialists who also are able to correctly diagnose condensation dampness and differentiate it from other forms of dampness in an existing dwelling. They need to have a good understanding of psychrometry, specifically in relation to water, vapour and air. And they've got to be able to distinguish between, as I said, those different forms of dampness and know how to use the tools available for them to do so. Because it's existing homes where the problem is. They've got to have also an understanding that there's other indoor air pollutants in addition to really excess water vapour. They will understand, specialists will understand when they've had the training and the knowledge to understand that very often you will have lots of other pollutants, and very often, for example, in VOCs, volatile organic compounds, the amount of ventilation you need to control those to acceptable levels to demonstrate adequacy of ventilation can often be higher than what you would need to control water vapour. And of course, you have to provide the higher of both, because there's no humidity control ventilation system that's only humidity control that are going to control VOCs to the level they need to be controlled for adequacy. And of course, excess VOCs can lead to respiratory conditions. We also need specialists who can identify all the different types of ventilation equipment by type that you can get within existing homes. Again, don't expect you to be able to kind of read this, but you'll see that these are just generic terms that I think apply to the type of ventilation equipment, the purpose-provided ventilation equipment you will find if you go around and look for them within different dwellings. There are so many different types. We don't just have axials and centrifugals and mixed flow. We have constant volume ones, we have continuously running ones, we have alternate flow ones, we have positive input ventilation ones. We have such a variety, and sometimes we have lots of combination of those, all fitted into different dwellings, sometimes all working against each other. I go into plenty of properties where there is some amount of air going through that building and there's still mould. It's not through a lack of air movement going around the building, it's just a lack of it not being done properly, because sometimes you can get ventilation systems fighting against each other. But of course, you've got to identify what's there in the first place, and they all perform and can be measured in a different way depending on what type of ventilation system or product it is. Just talking of products, one thing I would say at this stage is that over the past few years, the manufacturers of products, I think, have done a great job. And I mean, when I talk about product manufacturers, I'm talking about the people that provide us with the diagnostic tools, the people that provide us with the ventilation equipment, the manufacturers of fans and mechanical ventilation systems, the people that provide us with background ventilators by way of trickle vents, and the people that provide us with airflow measuring instruments. They have given us all in the ventilation industry incredibly good products to work with. What I think we've all got to do, though, is use those products that have been given to us. They're incredibly energy efficient, they have long life, low maintenance, but what we've got to do is people, as specialists, have to know how to use all those ingredients of products in the right way. I think a big issue we have to consider going forward, and a specialist has to be aware of at least, is the issue of air permeability and infiltration within an existing dwelling. If you look through approved document F, there is a big emphasis in trying to identify what the assumed or design air permeability is. That determines how you go about the ventilation. There is a big focus in new buildings, new dwellings, regarding infiltration. But there isn't really much when it comes to considering it when we look at ventilation in existing dwellings. So I think that a specialist has to be capable of looking at that and evaluating it or measuring it. And I've stuck a picture here of how I go about doing that type of thing when I have to, which is what's called an air permeability test carried out by a pulse test. He also, or she also, as a specialist, I think, have to be able to go in existing dwellings and evaluate purge ventilation measures in habitable rooms. They have to know that when you're counting the purge ventilation, of course, purge ventilation is real urgent. It used to be called rapid ventilation. When you need ventilation quick, you're trying to get about 4 air changes an hour ventilation really quick. It could be where there's really excessive pollution within the property. It might be, painting and the like. It might be excessive moisture for a short period of time, and you need rapid purge ventilation quickly within habitable rooms. And of course, that's normally provided via openable windows or doors to the outside. Now, if you go in and evaluate that, there are certain opening requirements in relation to the floor area of the dwelling that we have to comply with. So when I go in and do a ventilation adequacy assessment, and I would suggest that any specialist who does do, has to be trained to go in and look at and measure opening angles, and realise that regulatory-wise, the guidance documents are that if you have a window that only opens to 15 degrees or less, you can't even count that towards the floor area of purge ventilation. If you've only got between 15 and 29 degrees of opening, you can only count half of that towards, say, the 5% floor area of that habitable room. And it's only when you go above a 30-degree opening that you can count it fully, the opening area, towards purge ventilation. We need specialists to be able to go in and do that and identify if there's sufficient or insufficient, adequate or inadequate purge ventilation measures in habitable rooms. And of course, if you can, we've got to go in and evaluate if there is mechanical ventilation there at the rate of 4 air changes per hour. That is a challenge, to get 4 air changes per hour through a mechanical extract system in a bedroom, but that's what we have to evaluate, and we need specialists who can go in and look at that and consider, if it isn't there, how do we get it there? We need specialists who can carry out the same sort of assessment within wet rooms. So I'm not going to bore you with going through all the criteria that I've talked about before, but wet rooms are a bit more relaxed when it comes to purge ventilation requirements, because generally speaking, if you've got an openable window, you've got purge, and if you've got mechanical extract, you've got good purge in there as well. But they've got to be able to evaluate it and identify if that purge ventilation is appropriate or not. I think we also need specialists who can carry out a detailed assessment of the internal air transfer measures. We have to go around and measure the door undercuts. We have to take a view if small door undercuts are acceptable or not. In my view would be, we have to train specialists to look at what type of ventilation systems we can adopt a more relaxed attitude towards door undercuts, because we have to consider maybe a more relaxed attitude where we have door undercuts where, for example, there might be fire doors. Where we can't avoid a door undercut, we have to consider issues like transfer measures using intumescent grills and the like. But again, we need specialists who can go out and evaluate that, because it's absolutely critical that air is allowed to move throughout a building if we're to ventilate it properly. We need people who can look at the extract ventilation measures within wet rooms. They have to be able to go in there, and depending on the type of system, they have to know if that intermittent fan is up to the job, the continuous running fan is up to the job, and be able to evaluate that and identify if it's adequate or otherwise, categorising it always within what method of ventilation that they are assessing it against. And then we need to take into account what I think is the absolute critical factor when it comes to trying to either prevent condensation happening in a new build home or resolving it in an existing dwelling. And this is this term called this whole dwelling ventilation. In my view, and in my experience, if we can get that whole dwelling ventilation right, both in terms of the amount of air that we move through a property 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and how we move it through the property 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all the other things are a bonus. Purge ventilation is a bonus. Extract measures that are used occasionally in wet rooms, an extra bonus. Purge ventilation in wet rooms, a bonus. If we can get this whole dwelling ventilation measured, this in my experience is the single biggest thing we can do to try and resolve some of the big issues we've got with mold growth, streaming windows, all the usual stuff that goes with a poorly ventilated property. Now, they have to be able to assess that whole dwelling ventilation against a benchmark of something, and benchmarking it against a method of ventilation is how a specialist has to be trained and has the knowledge to be able to do. So, for example, if it's a natural ventilation system, that specialist has to go around and measure all the background ventilators in each room. And then if it's not on the actual background ventilator, the trickle ventilator, the equivalent area in millimetres squared, they have got to do an assessment of that using a particular protocol that they may have. But they have to go around and look at the background ventilation measures in every room. If they look, because it's going to be naturally ventilated that way, and determine whether that's adequate or otherwise. If it's a continuous extract system, they have to look at the whole continuous background ventilation rate, whether it be from a centralised continuous mechanical extract system, as is shown with the unit in the loft in the top right-hand corner of the page, or if it's individual wet room fans, which is shown in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide in the wet rooms. They have to be able to evaluate if the total airflow rate getting extracted from the building achieves the whole dwelling ventilation rate that's necessary to provide ventilation. If you look at the mechanical vent with heat recovery system, which is in the bottom middle row of the pictures in the slides, they have to be able to go in and assess if all the air being extracted from all the wet points is totaling the whole dwelling ventilation rate, and if all the supply being supplied into the habitable rooms also meets the whole dwelling ventilation rate. We need specialists who can do that. We need specialists who are able to go in and identify if a positive input ventilation unit is providing the whole dwelling ventilation measures needed. And then when you look at positive input ventilation, you will have to look at things like, do they have, where it's necessary, the enhancement fans that are required in certain wet rooms in certain conditions, depending on the layout of the property. If those measures are in place to ensure we've got the right movement of air, so that we're not putting in too much air, we're not taking out too much air, and we're balancing positive input ventilation systems properly. But I cannot emphasize enough just how important it is that we get that whole dwelling ventilation right. And that's the thing I spend most time on when I do ventilation survey cum assessments of adequacy for the clients I deal with, because I always tell them that if you get that right, you're on your way to, it's the biggest proportionate thing you can do, probably at a very low cost, to put adequacy of ventilation on the right path, if you like. I think what we need is, because we have to obviously measure ventilation that is installed, we need people who can accurately measure airflows and know how to use the instruments that are available to us. You know, the hooded anemometers, the thermal hot wire anemometers, where you can't maybe get the hood over the fan, know how to traverse things like cooker hood extract grills when you can't get it round, and work out how to work out the flow rate from the airspeed. And then all different techniques. They need to know how to measure ventilation equipment accurately. They need to know how to adopt protocols when the ventilation equipment itself can create a reduction in the actual flow when a hood's attached to it. They need to have protocols, for example, axial flow fans. They need to know the protocols you have to adopt to make sure that when you measure a fan and you think it's not achieving the flow rate, it actually might be. So you need to know how to do that, and specialists need to know how to do that measurement. So I think we need specialists that need to use that instrumentation properly. I think we need to have specialists who have a good understanding of what's involved in the installation, commissioning, certifying and maintenance of all types of ventilation systems in new build and existing dwellings. They need to know what happens from the time you design it and it's on an architect's drawing all the way through to you maintain it all through its lifestyle and everything in between. If you truly are a specialist, you need to know it from beginning to end. That's any field of professionalism. Specialists tend to know their subject matter inside out and everything that goes with it in the middle from beginning to end. And that's what we need specialists to do. We need to have them an understanding of the design, the installation, the commissioning, the certification of it, the maintenance, all the way through from the time it's, as I said earlier, an idea of what the ventilation might be, right through to that first 6 months after it, where you've got to look at perhaps maintaining, or at least giving a good clean to a mechanical ventilation with heat recovery system, and know what's involved in all that, know what's involved in the site practicalities of it. I think we also need specialists who are, while always being mindful that approved document 2010, the old document, and the more recent one, the 2021 guidance, makes quite a few assumptions in terms of what the ventilation requirements and therefore adequacy are based on. And it's actually really interesting that it's based on ventilation for people only. It's ventilation that assumes a certain thermal insulation of a building, and it also assumes a properly heated dwelling with typical moisture generation. Now, you can argue all you want about whether they are right or wrong assumptions, but they are the assumptions made when all the ventilation rates in the approved documents are based on those assumptions. However, I think a specialist has to face what we face when we go into properties and can have the ability, if required, to make adjustments to assessments and recommendations which take into account specifics related to dwellings, such as there may be animals in there that will produce significant quantities of moisture. I mean, large dogs, small dogs, cats, fish tanks, they all produce moisture. They also have to be capable of taking into account that the vast majority of dwellings are existing and therefore will not have the same thermal efficiency as new build dwellings that perhaps the assumptions made for building regulations assume exist. And of course, if you've got a building with high U values with poor thermal efficiency, you've really got to look at providing extra ventilation to drive down the dew point to stop condensation happening in it. So you've got to have that skill to know what to do when there's maybe extra occupants of the building other than people, for example, pets. You've got to be able to do adjustments to accommodate the fact that there may be poor thermal efficiency. You've also got to take into account that not every home will be properly heated. We have issues where people cannot afford to heat a house, so we have to consider that as part of the whole kind of discussion and have to be able to make adjustments to the ventilation as necessary. And also, if there's excess moisture generation, we don't always have typical, whatever typical is, moisture generation. Sometimes there is excessive moisture generation. We have to have specialists who are able to at least consider that and give a view on what can be done to try and address some of these specific issues that are not really addressed when we talk about what the guidance says in the approved documents. And I think then what we have to have is specialists who can then specify the additional ventilation measures necessary to provide adequate ventilation systems in a dwelling by means of one of the three main types of ventilation that's covered. And that is natural ventilation, which we've talked about, continuous mechanical extract, MVHR, mechanical ventilation with heat recovery, but also because we know, most of us here anyway, who are attending this, know that although it's not mentioned within any of the approved documents, and I'm not really sure why, but it's not mentioned, is positive input ventilation. Many of us believe that positive input ventilation is a good method of providing the type of ventilation that we need in existing dwellings to resolve problems in particular. And we need people that can go into a property and look at what's already there by way of existing ventilation measures, and what we can do then, or what we need to do to bring ventilation up to a level of adequacy by the extra bits that we need to add on to it. Because that's the clever bit, is looking at what's there. First of all, you've got to diagnose that it is a condensation dampness related problem. Then you've got to identify what's the easiest way I can get to adequacy based on what I've already got there, because we want to use what's already there as best we can. Pick one of the methods of ventilation to go for, and then go for it and add the additional ventilation measures to make sure that what's there, provided with what we think needs to go there, between all of those ingredients, we'll be able to demonstrate adequacy. And a type of job that we get involved in regularly, and I'm sure people here will get involved in this type of thing, this is the type of thing we get in existing dwellings. And I've stuck up a diagram here of a kind of property that I've been involved in looking at, and it's a ground floor flat, and it's actually reasonably new build. It should have been built and provided with ventilation in accordance with the 2010 regulatory requirements, or maybe even a bit before that, but either way, it should have had a good ventilation system. And when I turned up, what I found in that property, and just to look at it, you'll see it's a single facade. So if that was a single facade dwelling, then you would ordinarily be looking at that having, if it's natural ventilation, you would have loads and loads of trickle vents in the lounge and the bedroom. And because it's single facade, you would have expected to have trickle vents at high level and low level, if it was back in the day a natural ventilation system with extract fans fitted in the kitchen and bathroom, intermittent extract fans. Or you would have looked at continuous mechanical extract, which would have been continuous extract from the wet rooms and the trickle vents in the windows of the lounge and the bedroom. Or MVHR, which would have been supplying into the lounge and the bedroom and extracting from the wet rooms. What was actually there, and there was over a period of a number of years, more and more ventilation equipment fitted to try and resolve mould. And what you'll see is what's actually there is a combination of 3 different systems. Not one single system, 3 different systems. What you've got is one intermittent fan, which is part of a natural ventilation system. You've got one continuously running fan, which could be considered part of a continuous extract system. And you have a positive input ventilation, and putting aside that it's delivering air into the bedroom instead of the hallway, which is part of a positive input ventilation system. There is no shortage of air moving through that dwelling. Yet that dwelling still suffers from mould. And a specialist has to be able to go in and look at why that is, and then come up with a solution. And I wish I had time to go through what the solution was to that, but perhaps off air, and when we've got more time, if you're interested, contact me and I'll go through what we actually did in that job by way of a recommendation to resolve it. So how, where and when can we get the level of training and qualifications that we need? Well, a lot of it already exists, right? So you've got loads and loads of guidance documents, and I've only stuck up the various guidance documents related to ventilation here in England. And as I said, my colleagues in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, where I live here, we've all got similar kind of documents. They might look a bit different, but there's loads of documents about. It's not the most interesting reading, granted. My wife sometimes thinks, why am I reading all this sort of stuff? I must have better things I could be reading. But if you're going to become a specialist, you need to read that sort of stuff and understand it. And I'm not saying that you have to have an encyclopedic knowledge of it, but what you should at least be able to do is know where to look for the answer and the guidance. And those guidance documents already exist. I would encourage anyone to go to any kind of course that you can go to. And the very fact you've turned up here today suggests that you're really interested in doing it. There's loads of courses available, in-person courses, online, webinars like this one. And I would encourage anyone, particularly if you're looking at trying to become a member of a ventilation competent person scheme, and you're looking at doing a lot more work in new build, I think the BPEC and the NIC, EIC courses are really good ones to give you a good basic, so minimum technical competence level to do that. And of course, within the PCA, we have loads of courses on all sorts of stuff, which is really related to dampness and condensation dampness, and there's so many courses available through us and other organisations as well. Coming though, and Andy alluded to it and talked about it in a wee bit of detail earlier, is a course, and this sounds like a bit of a sales pitch, and I suppose it's going to come across that way anyway. But there is a course that we have now created within the Property Care Association that we think covers the learning material that's needed for all the stuff I've talked about by way of the specialist requirements earlier on in this presentation. And that is a course that has had a lot of input into it, and it will cover new build, existing dwellings, and it will be the type of course that I think covers everything I've talked about earlier on today. And it will result in, if you pass the qualification, a certificated specialist in dwelling ventilation. And it's a course that I think if you are interested in learning a bit more and becoming a specialist, I think it's something that you should at least consider. And there's more information, and Andy will no doubt talk about it a wee bit more after this, but it's all available on the PCA's website. I just want to give a few kind of thanks and acknowledgements to the following organisations that provided some images for this presentation. An organisation called ResiVent, another one called ElectFlow. I've used a lot of the Property Care Association information in our own organisation, and I've also got to make reference to the fact that this contains public sector information licensed under the Open Government Licence. I'm done, Andy, and it's over to you. So thank you for listening, folks, and no doubt there might be some questions.
Oh, well, fabby stuff. Well, John, do you know what I have to say? I'm impressed you even finished early. Well, folks, just to kind of let you know, we are just about to go on to kind of our questions. Do you know, John, just before we do go into questions, these webinars, and sometimes the information from these webinars, sometimes it fascinates me that it's sometimes the most simplest things in the world that you don't actually think about. Like, for example, door undercuts. That would have never have occurred to me, you know, on part of kind of the ventilation flow. Now, I know that might be a silly thing to say for folks that know I'm not necessarily a specialist or anything like that. But, you know, it's such basic stuff like that, you know, I almost look at it in the point of view, and I think someone mentioned it into the chat, that it's almost like we could make tenants more knowledgeable with regards to this, to basic stuff like this, that if we could educate, or maybe even if it's a case of local authorities, housing association could educate about the importance of this ventilation within the property, it would do so much good. It would. I mean, am I silly in saying that? Or
no, Andy, see, door undercuts, I know that there are specialists, people that are involved in the PCA that will go out and they understand that, right? There are people out there in the PCA doing the right thing and when necessary actually doing the undercuts as part of the works, because air has to be able to move about a property. Now, let me get you a bit of thought on that first of all, right? My view, right, is that, see, natural ventilation systems, you need a significant undercut because you have to rely on the buoyancy of air and the stack effect. However, when you've got continuous mechanical ventilation, where you've got ventilation driven by mechanical means, and you're creating the pressures that are able to overcome the resistance of the door undercut, I always take a bit more of a relaxed view about that. And of course, when you test the airflow, you're meant to test the airflow with mechanical ventilation systems with the door undercut. That actually proves the undercut's working anyway. So that's all part of the kind of training that we all have to learn. That one way of demonstrating if the undercuts are adequate or not is that I do 2 tests with airflow. Right, I shut the doors and open them, and if it's no different, I know the undercuts are sufficient.
Interesting. I think though, for and I know I'm kind of going on a minor thing here. I think the thing I was really gathering from everything that you were saying is that we're almost in a place where we're desperate for more people to get this specialist knowledge. You know, for more people up and down the country to really know this, so we can give reliable guidance not only to other professionals but to other people in itself. And you know, the more people that can grab hold of this knowledge, then the better we would all be up and down the country. It almost sounds to a certain degree that if you take away if you take away the ability and from as proper doing the analysis, it's a great business opportunity. You know, it's a great additional specialist arm that many individuals, and I'm actually more thinking more of our PCA boys and girls here that are dampness specialists.
Andy, honestly, Jim, through me coming in here, you're bang on, right? First of all, right, there's good business opportunities there, and I think that the people with kind of putting the PCA hat on here, right? But the people, because I deal with the PCA people all the time, right? And we have got the people within the PCA that have got the credentials to take that business opportunity, and who have the desire, in my experience, to want to do that. But isn't it great to be doing something that makes places better places to live, right? What a thing to do, and you can make a good money from doing a good thing. I think there's something in that as well. You know, we can all make a difference a huge difference to people's lives, because it can be a matter of life and death, ventilation. We know that from the tragic recent events, you know.
And even if you're not being a specialist in tech, even just having some base foundation knowledge, just that extra little bit that you can give good guidance on, I think the more people that can gain that knowledge and share that knowledge out can only be a good thing. And certainly, in my opinion, from what I'm gathering from what you're saying today. But conscious of time, and we do have kind of questions coming in. I'm going to start with some questions that came in via email. First one I'm going to start off with, and I apologise if I say your name incorrectly, comes from Dua Fatima. And she's referencing about the guidance, the difference in kind of guidance up and down the country. So they're asking, you mentioned several times that what you were referencing was principally to do with England, but kind of in general applies right throughout the UK. But can you summarise what the main differences in the regulations are up in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and also in Wales? Is there some real kind of rock solid differences, or is that almost a webinar in itself?
But the short answer is it's a webinar in itself as part of the training. But just to kind of tell people that what I'm very conscious of when I was putting together the training material for the new qualification is that we have to fine tune that to suit the different parts of the UK. So, for example, right, the first courses that are going to be run are going to be for England and Wales because they're almost identical. But there are a few changes in Wales where there's a few extra bits and pieces in terms of what you have to do by way of measuring ventilation equipment and taking records for existing dwellings in particular. But generally, England and Wales are almost identical. When it comes to Scotland, we have different things in Scotland. When it comes to Northern Ireland, we have different things. But what we've done in the course is there are certain modules that are individualised to suit the geographical locations, because we're conscious that people in Scotland who only work in Scotland will want to know more about the Scottish technical standards than people will want to know about approved documents in England and Wales. When it comes to existing dwellings, we're taking the view that there's a generic PCA approach, because houses are houses, dwellings are dwellings, people are people. So we will use, so we've looked at both, Andy, and there's no time to go into the detail of it here, unfortunately, but rest assured that we're very conscious of that, and we're adapting the training and the qualification to suit. So, for example, if I wanted to be a specialist dealing with work all through the UK, I'd want to get my modules that covered all four parts of the UK, if you like.
Right, okay. Well, I'm going to kind of try and summarize, just because of the questions now coming in thick and fast. I've had several questions from what looks to be chartered surveyors and valuers, all kind of along a kind of similar stem about when they're going down and evaluating what they should be looking at. But if I kind of maybe take Kirsty's as an example, as valuers, when they note mould and condensation, what recommendations should they be making in terms of when they look at the ventilation systems, and which specialists should they be recommending? Who should they be pointing people to? Now, I know there's some obvious answers to the end, and I don't want to sound like I'm punting PCA members here. So if you can maybe open that up a little bit more, John, just can answer the questions. One, what they should be picking up on and where they can find people that can give them help and guidance.
Well, I think just now what tends to happen is if there's an issue with mould, very often they'll be pointed towards what's already existing, which is PCA members with the appropriate qualifications. And of course, what will happen when this new qualification starts to take effect, then perhaps that's something that we look at in conjunction, in addition, in parallel with. But for the time being, right, I think people are pointing people towards, did I say, the right people, the PCA type of qualified people to look at. But as time moves on, when that ventilation qualification gets more established, it's probably going to be both that they'll be able to point towards, but they'll know that if it is a ventilation related matter, because it could, remember, you've got to diagnose it properly. You've got to diagnose if it's rising or penetrating. It won't always be, in a lot of the cases it will be, condensation dampness, but it won't always be. So you need both specialisms. You need people that can, which is part of the training course for the ventilation, but it's also part of the other courses we do in the PCA. So I would say for the time being, keep on doing what I think most people do. But as time goes on, we'll all be up in our skill base to try and resolve stuff specifically related to ventilation though.
Okay. Well, maybe I've got a wee follow-on question here that came from an email from Stuart Ray, where he was asking, should a chartered surveyor or a property specialist then, as standards during a level 2 or level 3 survey, be looking and reporting on air management systems?
I can only answer that shortly in a way of saying, yeah, I think so. You know, it's such a big issue just now, right? And it's such a big contributing factor to the enjoyment or otherwise of a home, right? Then maybe we need to look at it much more than we've ever looked at it before. Because let's be honest, every year, right, we have millions of people living, as I said at the beginning, in homes with dampness. And it's mainly condensation dampness. Yes. So we have to do something to try and resolve that. And I know that, you know, I'm old, right? My kids are going and kind of like buying houses and what have you, and I'm the sad dad who goes round and looks and does the ventilation adequacy assessment when he goes round and looks at their houses, because that's what I look for. But I think we should all be, especially whether you're a surveyor or whatever, I think we should all be at least looking at it in some kind of detail, because it's such an important thing.
Well, you know, I actually think that nicely leads on to a question that was posed by Steve Clark, but also there's many people that have been looking to this as well, which is principally to do with occupants' lifestyle within a property. Now, I mean, there has been several comments within the chat just blaming to a certain degree people's lifestyles within a property, and do you know, there is some truth to that, and I realise that. And John, you'll be able to speak a lot more on that particular issue with authority than I could ever speak of. But I suppose it leads on to maybe the question of, with occupants and the way that they use buildings in very different ways, do we need to then dive into a lot more detail on do we consider occupation characteristics as well as the ventilation system when we're looking at this? Now, to what degree do we have to do this? And do we need to start bringing out educational stuff like we spoke about earlier on and giving that out?
This is the big question, Andy, right? That's such a sensitive and kind of delicate matter to deal with.
Yes.
And I'm often, I do a lot of training, right, for landlords. And the big issue is kind of what's our kind of obligations and what have you, right, in terms of the provision of ventilation. And really what I say to them is that before you can even have a conversation about what might be going on specific to the kind of what's going on within the property by the occupants, you have to get, if you pardon the pun, your own house in order first in terms of what would be considered is kind of compliant. Because once you get that in place, and once you've provided ventilation that by a recognised benchmark, say for example, the only one we've really got to work on is the building regs and guidance documents.
Yes.
Once you've put something in place that would be recognised as adequate before people moved into a new dwelling, if you had that provided in an existing dwelling and all the assumptions that go with it, then at least you can have the conversation about, well, is there excess moisture generation in here? Is the ventilation system being used properly? But you can't even begin to have those conversations now. I always ask my clients, right, what is it that you want me to kind of assess adequacy against, right? Do you want me to take into account everything I'm seeing? Do you want me to take into account thermal inefficiency, high moisture generation? Because there eventually comes a point where you can put so much ventilation in it becomes self-harming to the ventilation. But if you're putting it in to try and control excessive moisture generation, you'll increase the heating bills to cope with the extra ventilation air that you have to heat up. So it's all of this kind of partnership between what the landlord, if you like, has to provide by way of the components to provide adequacy, and then having that conversation with the occupants about how they can get the best out of what's been provided by the landlord, because it's got to be that relationship between us all. So it's a very sensitive thing as well to kind of have that conversation about, but I always try and get a bit of a brief from my client up front, because there are sometimes unintended consequences of doing so much to suit whatever the particular occupancy behaviour is within that property that can actually make the problem even worse. But you've got to have the knowledge and the skill base to be able to explain what overventilating to accommodate excess moisture generation can actually create an even bigger problem than the one you're trying to resolve. But this is not the forum, but it's the type of conversations we'll have in detail on the course, because they're difficult, they're sophisticated, they're sensitive, but they're ones we have to have. But you can't have that conversation, I think, until you've got the knowledge to be able to have it. And that's why I think we all need to consider, if we're in this, whatever part you play in this whole business, right? I think we've all got to consider getting our knowledge base up to a level where we can have sometimes difficult conversations that are technically supported.
Well, okay, John. Well, here, do you know, I've had a couple of comments. There's a couple of questions that I think people really want to kind of get answered, but also as well, just for those that have been asking about the replay, yes, there will be a replay of this webinar available in the next 24 to 48 hours. John, next two questions going to hit you. They are quite long questions. Ideally, and just because time is short, if you can make the answers as short as possible.
The best.
Grace, be ready. But first question, Chris Jackson. He's asking if internal moisture readings are acceptable prior to habitation, then moisture levels rise over time to the point where the internal fabric is affected. How can the cause be determined to separate the excess additional moisture as opposed to the defective design or build? Looking at this from the point of view from a claims perspective.
Gosh, Andy, the question was very long, and I don't think I've got the time to give a detailed answer, right? So can I just say to you this, right? That my first aim, anytime I go and do an assessment, right, whether the building's occupied, unoccupied, or whatever, right, I always look at what's there, right? Because I know I've always got to establish what is there in terms of adequacy, and I benchmark it against whatever standard I choose. So I'll benchmark it against whatever the regulations were or are at the time that ventilation was provided. And then that's my first point that we'll look at. All the other stuff that we've talked about what about happens here, and what it's too long and detailed an answer to kind of do in this forum. I'm sorry for not being able to answer it better than I can. But we at the end of the day, one thing I would say is that it's occupants that produce moisture and pollutants. It's not bedrooms, right? Which, as I said earlier on when I talked about it, that's a bit of a concern I've got about the new regulatory guidance documents that have come out by way of approved document F. They talk about ventilation provisions based on bedroom numbers and floor area instead of occupants. But occupants produce pollutants, not bedrooms.
Okay. Well, folks, I'm just going to ask one more question because I think it's a really good question. But just to let everyone know, we are just running a couple of minutes over. If everyone just can hold on just for another couple of minutes, hopefully this question will be of interest to you. But the question and the last question I'm going to hit you with is from Sarah Davis. And again, it's another long question. So what she's asking is, one topic that keeps coming up is installation sign-off documents in the building regs. Now, the argument is who should be completing these documents and when. Is it a case, do the commissioning documents need to be completed on every fan installation from an installation point of view and on a commissioning level? Now, she's given an example here to give a wee bit of context here, which is an electrician installing stroke replacing extract fans is not necessarily a ventilation competent and qualified person. What do you think?
The really short answer, if I can. If you install ventilation equipment in an because we're talking about existing homes, I think, aren't we? Right?
Yes.
If you install ventilation equipment in an existing home, if that piece of ventilation equipment can be tested and adjusted, you might not test and adjust it, but if it's got a humidistat, a run-on timer, if you can switch its airflow, and you'll really find a fan that cannot be tested and adjusted, I'll tell you one that may not be, right? But if you can test and adjust it, it must be notified to building control. Now, there's only two ways you can do it, either through a ventilation competent person scheme who can self-certify it, or you go through the normal building control process. In Wales, one of the big differences is that you actually have to record for Wales in existing dwellings the airflow as well, right? Whereas in England, you only record airflows in new dwellings, really. That's the kind of guidance in there. But in Wales, it's new dwellings and existing dwellings. Now, let me give you an example of a fan that you could fit that doesn't require testing and adjustment. A cooker hood. A cooker hood is a thing you fit, and you know there is no run-on timer, generally speaking. Anyway, there is no humidistat. You can't really adjust it. It's got its settings. But any fan that can be tested and adjusted, it's very clear. If you read through the documentation, the guidance to the building regs, you've got to be able to notify it to building control.
Who would, and I can just very quickly, and I apologise for taking a wee bit longer, but kind of going back on to Sarah's question, that person that's notifying building control or signing off that document, she referred to the electrician, you know, and putting that into kind of context there, who's not necessarily a specialist. Should he really be signing that off then and then notifying building control?
There's two bits, Andy, right? You've got the electrical bit that they have to do right, but then there's the notification of the ventilation bit. So remember way back, the slide I showed you about why electricians go on NIC, EIC, or BPEC courses. They go on it to get the ventilation qualification that allows them to join a ventilation competent person scheme. They've already probably got the electrical bit. What they need to get is the ventilation bit that allows them to give the type of certificate of sign-off, the self-certification certificate that I showed, I think, a few slides back. So that's why they do it. That's why they go. That's why it's mainly an installer's course, so that they have. And of course, it's a legal requirement to kind of like comply with building regs. That's why people go on those courses to get the qualification necessary to do that bit. But it's mainly installations, so that's what it would be used for.
And in fairness, there's not that many courses out there, and there hasn't been up until the last year, with demand and again tragic events have actually led to us all having to basically up our game in terms of knowledge-wise. So I can understand that to a point of view, and it was great that at least we've had something in the past that at least gives a foundation.
Do you know, Andy, do you mind if I come in here, because it's an important point? I'm conscious of the time, and it's all related. The new qualification, again, this is a sales pitch, not meant to be, right, but I'm just trying to answer the question a bit more as well. The qualification that we're working on, right, the CSDV qualification, it will cover what I think anyway will be all the type of things you would ordinarily cover on some of the courses that currently exist for being able to apply to a self-certification scheme, but all the other stuff on top, all the other stuff like diagnostics, all the other stuff, that the complicated stuff of going into existing dwellings. So that would be the intention, I'm sure, of the PCA, to take that forward to some of the people that run the ventilation competent person schemes and say, look, we cover all the stuff of competency that you need, plus a country mile more in terms of all the stuff that goes on inside existing dwellings we need to know about.
Okay, well, guys, here I'm very, as John quite rightly said, very conscious of time. You heard John say earlier on, I mean, there isn't really one place where we can all get this information. Well, hopefully that is now kind of changing, but up on the screen here is just some places where you can get some, to some degree, some base information and some broad information. Includes the ventilation document library that I have in the PCA. There is, as John alluded to as well, approved document F as a source of reference. There is as well, John mentioned it as well, our CPD library, where there's a variety of helpful content there that you can kind of dive into, and of course as well the professional section of the website. You heard John as well looked at other places over the course of the webinar. Now I've just stuck those links into the chat for anyone that wants to kind of take a look at it. I will reference it into the show notes as well. I'm not going to go too much into this, but you already heard John mentioned all about the new specialist course in dwelling ventilation. If you are interested on it, the link is up there. Just go to property-care.org/CSDV. There is other kind of courses if you are interested as well to learn a little bit more. You heard John again mention about our ventilation masterclass also. If that is of interest to you, you can just go to the website, PCA website, property-care.org/training and qualifications. Just before we kind of finish off, I just want to very quickly just mention about our 2023 International Property Care Conference. Those that have been before, or those that were at the Structural Waterproofing Conference, you know this is a great day, and you know the amount of learning that you will get from this day. Currently, we're still working on the programme. While it's waiting to be released, we do have an early bird offer. Only for PCA members, it's 150, non-members 210. Really is great value for money. And if you do find conferences out there for a full day, even includes a lunch, that is of better value than that, then please tell me, but I will be really surprised if you do. All again you need to do is just visit the link on there and you will find more information. Just for those as well that might have the smartphones kind of handy and you do want to kind of find out more information, feel free to kind of scan the links that are just on your screen just right now. What you need to do is get the camera out and kind of scan it there, similar as well if you're on the replay, and it will take you straight to information about the conference and the new course. Just before we sign off our September webinar, we are actually taking a little bit of a break for August where lots of people are having the holidays. Our next webinar will be on the 28th of September. We're still working on the title, but it will be based on water shock, the rise of damp problems in new builds. Look out for information coming soon on that, either on the webpage or via our social channels. Finally, it just leaves me to say to yourself, John, a big thank you for sharing this knowledge and your information. On behalf of everyone that was tuned in, I think it was great, and it was very kind of you to do so. For everyone that joined us this morning, a big thank you to yourself for joining us. Hopefully, again, you took a lot from the webinar. And lastly, all it leaves me to say is good morning to everyone, and hopefully you have a lovely rest of the day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.